geopolitics. I like the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than getting bogged down in the details of things, I do like to have sort of the big picture. So we talk a little bit about geopolitics.
There are sort of tectonic shifts going on globally, aren't there?
Yeah.
They're a little bit gradual, as all tectonic shifts are, but they are happening at the same time. And with all shifts, there are frictions. And I think that's probably what you're going to be talking about, right?
Yeah, well, so at the moment, there's the Brics summit, and the 16th one. It's being held in Russia at the moment, so obviously in Putin's manner, on Putin's manner. And I just think it's interesting to talk a little bit about sort of the shifting power dynamics in the whole world.
After the roaring success of our UK election coverage, we are indeed doing another massive Lotus Eaters livestream to cover the US elections on Tuesday, the 5th of November. We will have a giant roster of guests, both in the studio and remotely via Zoom, and we will be live streaming on Rumble, so we'll be able to say exactly what we think, no holds barred. Do tune in, it's going to be great, and hopefully we'll be ringing in Trump's second term, or perhaps we'll be having a massive meltdown. Who knows what the future holds. See you then.
Because there's this classic thing, sort of who controls the world. I think we did a round table on it, or we did some sort of thing. I think it was mainly behind the paywall, though, a few months back, where we talked all about this.
We did, yeah.
Remember?
Yeah, of
course. A while
course.
ago now. I can't remember exactly how it went. But my feeling is that the real reality is that there's not a single cabal of people running the world, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just like a shadowy cabal of like Wall Street bankers or something.
It's like they can all fit in to one room around one table, and they're in this smoke-filled room with, dark wood paneling on the walls, and they're smoking cigars and putting their bars of gold on the table.
That's not really how it works.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, Moscow and Beijing do not have to answer to anyone at the State Department or on Wall Street or in the Federal Reserve or in the White House. They really don't. Right? Riyadh doesn't have to answer to Washington.
They do sometimes, though.
Well, they do. Sometimes they do, yeah. Like, we don't have to. We nearly always do. But we don't have to, right? France doesn't have to do what America tells them, right?
To be fair, France is one of those countries in Europe that is least inclined to do what the State Department tells them to.
So I think there's all sorts of different levels to it, right? So there's money, so, and people argue, don't they? All sorts of people argue about which is the most important in the cathedral, whether it's whether it's money that controls it, whether it's still military might or all sorts of things.
I think it's got to be a combination, because these things are not worthless. I think that the way that a lot of these things work is there are networks of people, and particularly in very elite circles, people generally know each other, don't they, quite well?
Always.
And there are sort of business relations that form and break away, and it's organic. It is, at the end of the day, they're still human beings and they operate in a similar way, but it's just that they have different concerns. But I think that money, political power, martial might, potential other non-governmental organizational power as well, all of these things are tangible and tie into the nature of power and which elites rule and which ones are out of favour.
So even within the West, even if we just talk about the West, we could start with maybe the intelligence services, the Five Eyes, who really, really controls that on sort of a day-to-day or hour-to-hour basis. The giant intelligence networks of the West and sort of Australia and stuff. To what degree are they even... So take, for example, we've got NSA, the CIA, but then Britain, GCHQ, MI5 and MI6. Mm-hmm. Are they all exactly on the same page, controlled by the same room of cigar-smoking dudes? No, they're competing with each other, actually, largely. Oh, and the FBI, throw the FBI in there. Mm-hmm. CIA, FBI, anyway.
Because,
so
of course,
it's
the
not
CIA...
as simple as there's a handful of guys somewhere controlling all of that. It's not reality, right? And that's just the West.
Mm-hmm. Because, of course, wasn't there a scandal where the CIA or the FBI were caught bugging each other at one point?
Oh yeah. I mentioned earlier in the last segment, but I'll say it again. I'm fascinated by the story of intelligence services. Been reading lots about the Cambridge Five at the moment. Burgess and Philby and Cairncross and all these guys. And there's a great book called Spycatcher, which I'm just finishing at the moment, by Peter Wright. And yeah, the relationship between MI5, MI6 and GCHQ is very fraught. And throw in Special Branch, the police, on top of that. Right? They each think they're the most important and trying to get funding off of each other, and there's revolving doors at the top, and it's a delicate, difficult, interesting relationship. And the same goes in America between
that makes sense,
the FBI
though, doesn't
and
it?
CIA.
Because that's how human incentives work. It isn't like someone is going to overlook their own self-interest within an organisational structure and how they sort of ascend it and get more money, basically, by saying, well, actually, I'm going to defer to this other organisation that I'm not a part of. That's just not how human beings work.
And there's all sorts of like signal intelligence or pure military intelligence services, and like the army will have its own intelligence wing and all sorts of things. So they're all competing against each other. And even if in principle there's supposed to be someone at the top of it all, like Homeland or something, or the guy at the top of the Defence Department or something controlling it, in reality they will be competing with each other. And so that's just the West, and that's just the intelligence services. And then you've got the money men thrown on top of that. And then you've got people at, say, the State Department or in the White House or in Downing Street that nominally, on paper, are supposed to control it. Or someone at the Foreign Office is competing with someone in the Cabinet Office, right? It's not... It's really quite complicated. There's loads and loads of levels. And that's just in the West. That's not taking into account that Moscow is got its own flag, literally. But you know what I mean. It's its own thing. It's its own power base. Beijing doesn't have to answer to anyone in the United States, right? In India, they don't have to do what the Chinese are trying to force them to do.
Well, they don't like the Chinese.
Right.
They see them as political enemies, don't they?
So, great lead into what I want to talk about then. So, there's, broadly speaking, and this is low resolution, but you can only really be low resolution when you talk about geopolitics, right? The sweep of decades and the whole world. When we've only got a few minutes to play with, we can only be fairly low resolution. But broadly speaking, you've got like the G7 biggest economies, you know, the US, the UK, France, Japan, and then the Brics, Russia and China, Brazil, yeah.
South Africa, isn't it?
Yeah, South Africa. Well, the actual Brics is, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But they're also have now included, they've let in, there's like about 30 other countries that want to get in it. But so far they've let in Egypt and Ethiopia, UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. Right. So, and there's lots of other countries where they're sort of proxies, or they're just on that side of the ledger. Like say Iran. Iran's going to be much more closely allied to Brics than it is to the G7, of course. Right. Obviously.
Of course.
But then, right, it's complicated. So. Okay, you've got Iran and Saudi Arabia in the same block. Good luck with that. You're going to have complete cooperation, are you, between them? Yeah, sure, that's going to happen. China and India, classic example. No, they're strategic enemies, or if not enemies, rivals.
Yeah.
Absolutely strategic rivals in all sorts of ways. But they're supposed to be completely on board and be working all exactly in the same direction. Even Russia and China, their relationship, going back to the Mao years, or before, going back to the pre-World War II years, it's extremely fraught and interesting. On my own channel, History Bro, check that out. I've got an 18-part series where I talk all about Mao. And I go back to the beginning of the 20th century when Mao was a child. And obviously you go through the Bolshevik Revolution. The relationship between China, even pre-communist China, and Bolshevik Russia is extremely complicated. It's not like, they're all, or after Mao anyway, they're all Reds. They're all communists, so they're on the same page and it's one big block now. No, not at all. That's not how it works. Like GCHQ, MI5 and MI6 being completely working in unison. No. The FBI and the CIA absolutely working as one single organism. No way, not at all. Right, so Brics, like this thing, it's like this counterpoint to the G7.
It's basically an economic block, isn't it?
That's
what it's positioned as. I don't want to sort of steal your thunder here, but could I say what I think the main reason for Brics existing is?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So my sort of working theory, and they may have even stated it explicitly, is not particularly revelatory, is that what they're trying to do is undermine the United States dollar as the default reserve currency. Because
that's what Russia wants about. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Because I think that is the main source of the United States' power internationally, isn't it? Is that ultimately the United States dollar is used as a reserve currency. You know, there was the petrodollar for a very long time, and this gives them real hard power because, of course, the dollar is controlled by the US central bank, and therefore, what they choose to do has international consequences. And so you want to be favourable with the US, because if they affect the dollar in a way that is disadvantageous to you, then you're potentially looking at losing a lot of money, or potentially gaining a lot of money if you are favourable towards them. So there's a lot to be gained or lost, and I think that what's going on here is this coalition is forming to counter this quite extensive power that the US government has created.
No, absolutely. Putin particularly has been squeezed by sanctions coming from the West, from the United States. Yeah, and if the world currency wasn't pegged to the dollar, that would be extremely profitable for him. So that's one of their main things. But that would be in the benefit of the Chinese as well, and the Saudis and the Iranians and whoever, and Brazil, and on and on and on. Yeah. So after the Cold War, once the Berlin Wall came down, and in fact the entire Soviet project collapsed, we were in a world really where the United States was the sole hegemon of the world, really, to all intents and purposes. We're moving now into a world where that's being less and less the case, at least economically. I mean, it is worth pointing out that America still absolutely dominate in terms of military power. People look at recruitment ads for the US military, and it's all a bit woke and fey, and they say, "Oh, America's weak now." No, not at all. Their navy dominates the waves, absolutely dominates in terms of aircraft carriers and helicopter carriers, all sorts of. Yeah, the US Air Force is absolutely dominant.
It does hurt a British person to say this. We're not saying this to
necessarily
be nice as well.
Right, yeah.
Britannia did once rule the waves. It is sort of a sore point for us.
In terms of a nuclear submarine program, America's won that. Yeah, America dropped out. No one can compete. I mean, Britain is probably one of the closest. China and Britain are probably the closest where we actually build our own nuclear submarines. But still, even our nukes, Britain's nukes, are just bought off the Americans, right? Like France, I'm pretty sure France completely manufacture their nukes from scratch. Of course, the Chinese do. Of course, the Russians do. So there's many layers. Talking about nukes, nuclear capability, then talking about a submarine program, then talking about just aircraft carriers, and then just sort of fast jets, fleets and fleets of fast jets. America dominates all this stuff.
Because, of course, when it comes down to it, having diplomatic power and having power over currency is one thing, but the real hard power is martial might, and the US still dominates in that by a significant margin. So, if it were the United States and Europe, for example, versus the Chinese military, presuming it doesn't go nuclear, of course, it'd be
no contest. It'd be no contest.
Exactly.
Assuming there's no nukes, if America deployed everything it's got against China, there'd be no contest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. America could do that to anybody, assuming no nukes are in play. Because the Chinese have got a few hundred nukes, most people think. That's enough to... Yeah, that's enough. So there's just many, many layers to this. So the Brics thing, the way the BBC put it is, they say this, the West has dubbed you, i.e. they talk about Putin, the West have dubbed you, Putin, a pariah for invading Ukraine. Sanctions are aiming to cut off your country's economy from global markets, and there's an arrest warrant out for you from the International Criminal Court. How can you show the pressure is not working? Try hosting a summit. And they're basically saying this is just Putin trying to sort of show off, trying to sort of put a brave face on it. In fact, his economy is crumbling under his feet, which may or may not be true. I don't think it is particularly
true. I don't think it is true, but there's also a lot of... wasn't it a big expose that a lot of countries were still getting Russian resources just through shell companies in Europe, and that a lot of the sanctions were being circumvented, and they're sort of sanctions in name only?
One reality you cannot get around is that the size of Russia means that it's resource rich.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got a country the size of Russia or the United States or China, you're going to be resource rich. Both Russia and the United States don't, if they really, really needed to, don't need to import anything from anyone ever. Mm-hmm. They really wanted to just get all their own resources, maybe with the exception of some rare earth metals and things. But basically,
you need Africa for that, don't you?
Maybe, yeah. But basically, Russia is resource rich. Far more resource rich than Britain. We're a tiny little island, really. But yeah, it's just what I was saying earlier, where that we were in a world post Berlin Wall of America being the sole hegemon, and now we're starting to move away from that a bit, because Brics does represent, if nothing else, not saying China and India are on exactly the same page, you're going to be pulling in the same direction and have no animosity to each other whatsoever. I'm not saying that, but if Brics represents some sort of bloc that can stand in the post-Soviet era, which can stand against the might of the United States and the West, Brics is something like that, right? I mean, China, its economy is sort of monstrous.
Yeah, but then again,
no way around it.
They do have an incoming debt crisis. Like a lot of their local government was funded based on taking out loans on assets, which is not sustainable, and they're basically going to have to restructure their entire economy. And there is a risk of them being caught in the middle income trap, which would be catastrophic for the Chinese. And I think that there's actually quite a likelihood of that happening. But of course, you never know with these things, right? But also Russia, a lot of fuss is made about Russia. Their economy is the same size as Texas.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Which isn't necessarily a small economy. It's not nothing. However, to compare it to the entirety of the United States would not be an even comparison.
When it comes to economics, I think, Dan has talked to our Dan Tubb. Check out his stuff on lotuseaters.com. His Brokenomics series, where he talks all about economics. The size of the American debt, 35 trillion at the moment, and climbing steadily every single day. But yeah, I mean, China is... You're quite right to suggest that maybe the Chinese economy is a house of cards.
Well, I mean, lots of their structures are, aren't they?
Well, literally, yeah. If and when the rest of the world... If there's some sort of large-scale depression, and the rest of the world's Western economies collapse, we stop importing all their stuff, will their internal economy be able to stand up to that? But there's just one graphic here. I mean, look how giant China is compared to even India or Russia. And like Saudi, for all their vaunted wealth with oil, yeah, some of their royal family can buy a fleet of chrome-plated Rolls Royces, but Saudi Arabia, compared to the Chinese economy or compared to India, is still, nothing. Egypt, nothing. UAE, nothing. Well, I say not nothing, but in comparison, relatively speaking, is what I mean. So China's the big dog. Absolutely the big dog. Dwarfs Russia, right? Dwarfs it. Nonetheless, Brics does represent an actual counterpoint to G7. It does. And politically speaking, they're not on the same page. It's hard enough for Britain and America. The story of that I talked about the Cambridge Five and Peter Wright, the spy catcher and stuff. How difficult it was just to get the NSA, this is in the 50s and 60s, just to get the NSA and GCHQ to talk to each other. Extremely difficult. And we're basically brothers, cousins at least. We're basically completely on the same side. The special relationship, especially during the early years of the Cold War, absolutely should have been pulling in the same direction. But they were still standoffish with each other and not really prepared to give each other secrets and stuff. It took a long time, before Britain and America could truly, really sort of pull together. So whether countries like China and India will be able to,
no chance.
Whether Russia and China will be able to is a different story.
And I think they've got two very different agendas, don't they? And two very different situations. Yeah. And I feel like the circumstances alone are enough that they're not going to unify under a single cause, because they've got their own people to worry about ultimately.
Right, yeah. They truly are a power base in their own right. The Kremlin will never ever want to have to truly answer to Beijing, and vice versa. And Washington goes for the same, probably, maybe, unless they're already completely infiltrated by the CCP, which may or may not be the case, but that's speculation for another time. Okay, we'll move on from that. But Brics is going on at the moment. and they may be a true counterpart, or they kind of are a true counterpart to the G7. And we're moving into a world where there's more than simply one hegemon. Interesting to note.
I hope you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, and if you want to see what else we're up to, you could always follow Bo's series Epochs. This time he's talking about Caesar entering Gaul. And if you want to see all the other things that we're talking about, you can always follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.